Well, I'm delighted to have Rachel here in Hamburg today, and we've decided to have a chat about Handel's violin sonatas. We're absolutely passionate about these pieces. You will be familiar with Rachel's recording of them from 2018, but it'd be interesting, I thought, to explore the background to them and who might have played them and a little bit of social history of the time. So over to you, Rachel. Do you want to start us off?
Well, I have to say, you're the more you're the more grounded in this in the background. I have to say, I just played them, but they were amazing pieces to play. Really fun, good tunes, and it was easy to make music out of it. But about the history, I think you're very much better in a better position to tell us about. They span a really long time over as
Yeah.
well, don't they?
They do. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot quite like that, but no, I think you've hit on the nail on the head. They are fun. I mean, we've played these pieces together over 20 years actually. I was looking back through my music and sometimes I put dates on it, and I think we probably first played the D minor sonata, gosh, when we were at college together. You know, that's well over 20 years ago, and the D major sonata. So the pieces in our history with them span a huge time frame. So actually, we bedded them in for about 20 years before committing them to disc, which is, I think, quite a nice time frame to really feel that we know them properly. But the time frame of the pieces themselves is quite interesting because we've got 9 violin sonatas. Now that's slightly contentious in the Handelian world because there are only 5 authenticated ones, and that is 5 that actually you have a Handel manuscript for, Handel's autograph handwriting. The other 4 exist in a first printed edition. So some scholars regard them as not necessarily Handel. I'm pretty sure, I think you feel the same way, Rachel,
Yes.
that we can take them as Handel. I mean, the musical language, it's got his stamp, it's his personality, his mark firmly on them. But the time frame you mentioned is quite interesting because I guess nowadays sonatas are either written, contemporary violin sonatas might be written for a particular player, or sets might be published in a particular time. But these span roughly, well, from roughly 1707 to 1710. That was the date of the very first violin sonata when Handel was in Italy, in Rome. And the final one is 1751 in London. So that's a huge, pretty much 40 odd years. And they weren't intended to be collected together. So naturally, there's going to be a difference in style, I think, between the sonatas, or one imagines there might be. Is that right, Rachel? Do you find that with them?
I do. I find there is really an order. So the first one is very, very youthful, and it's completely different to the others. It only has 3 movements, and all the others that we recorded have 4 movements. It's odd, though, I think, to to think that they're not published as one set. I mean, he published so many sets, and that, I think, is what made it so difficult to pin him down. There was one sonata which says for hautboy solo, for solo oboe, and it it goes too low for the oboe, so it can't be for the oboe. But so there is quite a lot of confusion. Was it Walsh who published first? Did they? Is there an opus number to his collections?
Yes, there is actually. It was Walsh who published them. Initially, they were published. There were 12 published in 1730, and they were published. I'm just looking at it now. The title page doesn't say Walsh; it says Roger, which is the Amsterdam publisher. But the book was in fact published by John Walsh in London, who was connected with Etienne or Jean Roger at that point in Amsterdam. So we find some sonatas published in 1730, and then we find in a couple of years later the same book with a few changes is published in roughly 1732 in London, and it's listed as being more correct than the former edition. And I think this is just to maximise money, basically, isn't it? To make you think you've got to buy. It's like buying the latest iPhone, isn't it? You've got to have the newest version of the kit. So you've got to buy the latest version of the sonatas. but they weren't published with an opus number. The first time we find an opus number ascribed to them is not till the 19th century with Chrysander's publication. Chrysander, Friedrich Chrysander, published the complete Handel works long after Handel's death, and there they're called opus 1.
So if he's got a book with 12 sonatas in, and only 5 sonatas have autographed manuscripts, and let's say we recorded 9, so we think 9 of them are original. What about the others in that set? I mean, and are there some missing? I mean, the final one's probably missing, the D major one. So that leaves 8.
Yeah.
Are those 8 in there?
Well, the other ones that were published include for other instruments, you see. He's hedging his bets. So the title page lists German flute, oboe, or violin. So it's not just what we regard as the violin sonatas. And I think that's where the confusion has happened with that sonata where it mentions oboe, but it's too low. That's the G minor one, isn't it?
Yeah. You
can't actually play it on an oboe. So I think right from even within Handel's lifetime, there was confusion about what were his violin sonatas and what weren't. And it's been easier to just stick to the 5.
Were they all the sonatas in this 12 set by him?
Yes, I believe they were. Yeah.
And how many of the ones that we recorded are in it? Not 8, I can't think.
They are all in it eventually. It's going to get very geeky if I start listing all the swaps and changes between the 2 sets. But basically, everything we've recorded is covered in either the 1730 or 1732 version, apart from the final violin sonata, because he hadn't yet written that.
Oh.
We had to wait another 20 years for that one. So I think people have been nervous for a long time of saying what's definitely Handel, hence sticking to 5 sonatas. But I think the other 4 are such joyous pieces of music anyway. And Handel was such an astute businessman. He definitely knew what was being published and under his name. So even if there is the slimmest chance they weren't by him, he was happy to have his name put to those pieces. So
I suppose he got royalties from it. So.
Yeah, he would have earned money, and I don't perceive any drop in quality with the music. In fact, I'm going to, lay my cards on the table here. One of my favourite Handel violin sonatas of all time is one of the spurious ones, the F major. I absolutely love that piece, and that's one of the few that we don't have an autograph for. But to me, it absolutely speaks Handel. It's joyous, it's fun, it's life-enhancing, really.
Oh, well, and that opening. I mean, the first few bars, you've got this just proclaiming an F major chord, and then he goes on to do something delicious.
I know.
That's Handel. That's Handel. It's just, maybe a lesser composer would either have gone on to take that, broken chord apart and worked it out, or done maybe something less juicy or more Italianate, because I think, he's a German coming to England and he did write Italian operas, but he wasn't as Italianate as Bononcini or Geminiani or these other people. What do you think? I mean, even his first one where he was in Rome, that's not really Italian either.
No, and that's a criticism that's often levelled against him. And I think if you look at the violin sonatas as a whole, he may be considered at the end of his life to have been slightly more conservative in style than some of the other composers around who were working in the 30s and 40s in London and into the 50s. And one of the things I find interesting is trying to picture who might have known these pieces, who might have played them, looking at names of violinists who are around. And a couple of names keep cropping up with this, and actually these names are also composers themselves, and it's interesting to note that their styles are quite different from Handel's. So Francesco Gimignani, who was an Italian-born composer living in London, he knew Handel, he worked with Handel from 1714. He eventually ended up in Ireland, but he was very connected with the London music scene, and his violin sonatas, in fact he wrote cello sonatas too, they're completely bonkers, aren't they? They're quirky as anything.
Yeah, they're so bonkers that they do crazy harmonic things. They go of in, but we like the framework in the Baroque. So you have like a set amount of bars, and he sometimes explodes that, and harmonically he's going and doing things that are unheard of. I would think at that time, and influenced a lot of people. And also his writing was much more complicated for the violin. So you have, technically speaking, a lot more work to do with the left hand. And possibly he was a chin-off player. I think quite possibly, according to his treatise and who his teachers were, where he came from, he was probably a chin-off player, which I think Handel, he didn't come from a place where there was chin off. I think he came from where people played with chin on. So this goes back to Handel's time in Rome and where Corelli was there. And he was also a chin off player. There's another story to that. But in the Italians in England had a great influence on this crazy type of composing and technical writing for the violin. There are hardly any chords in Handel's sonatas, violin sonatas. It's playable by just about anyone who can pick up the violin and play a decent sonata. You don't have to be amazingly brilliant. You don't have to sit down and practice those chords for weeks on end before they're playable.
So don't put yourself down, because they may not be technically difficult, but actually the skill, I think, with a lot of this music is in the interpretation of it and actually conveying Handel's meaning and message. In my experience, pieces like Gimignani's cello sonatas, they're flashy and fiery and furious, and that requires a different kind of technical input, whereas the Handel ones, I think, require a lot of thought and a lot of heart to play them. Certainly from a bassline perspective as well. But there's a connection, actually. You're talking by chin off. Can you just clarify? You mean, so Corelli would have positioned the violin. Oh, you've got one to hand.
I have.
Perfect. He would have positioned it slightly lower.
So it's rather out of tune. I haven't tuned it yet today. So the modern day, well, actually I can't say modern, there were various different ways of holding the violin in the Baroque, all the way from as we know it up here to without the chin, to further down here, even sort of like, that's, I find, quite a solid place. And some even say that Nicolas Matthes, the elder, held it all the way down here and played. It does restrict. I don't think that he played that low, Matthes. I think he played it here. It was a short rib, they said. So, but I wonder if that was the short rib. But this does make it slightly harder to do high position work. So Corelli, I think, played up here. We have pictures, engravings of him holding, not engravings, I think they are drawings, ink drawings of him holding like that. I have to look that up if that's an engraving or a drawing. But he's actually holding it down here. Whereas his pupils, Corelli's pupils, hold it up here. So Locatelli can reach higher positions, because it's just about getting past the body of the violin, really.
Yeah.
Down here,
neck in the way otherwise, haven't you?
Turn my arm very well, so I can't actually, and I can't come down so well. There's this technique of climbing up and down here. You can certainly reach up higher.
Which you need that for the very first Handel sonata, don't you? It's got a slightly comic, I'm not going to ask you to play it, but it leaps up into the stratosphere, doesn't it? And we think that possibly Corelli might well have played that sonata, might have known it. It could have even been Handel having a little go at Corelli for not wanting to play particularly high, because it leaps up pretty much to the end of the violin fingerboard, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. I have the bass part here. Hang on. And the violin part I have here. It's quite amazing. I've got some fingerings in here, but it's the bit between my two fingers. Is it possible to see that?
Oh yes, and we've got the octave added into it. Yeah.
Yeah. and I couldn't believe that. And for a long time I thought, it's a misprint, maybe it's a different number, so it's actually going up and it's a third higher, and it didn't work, nothing worked. And then we thought about this thing with Corelli, that it was written in Rome. Corelli was in Rome. Corelli had a few mishaps playing an orchestra where there were some overtures to pieces written really, really high, where he couldn't reach, and the tutti violinist could reach, and he basically went home in disgrace. And Handel knew of that story. And then there was Il Trionfo, was it?
Yep, it was, yep.
Where he writes something up in the stratosphere, and oh dear, I mean, Corelli must have had a hard time of that. And in this, I think Handel is he's making fun of Corelli.
Yeah,
I don't think that I'm not so sure Handel would have played that himself.
No, I mean, we know Handel was a violinist, but not a particularly good violinist. I mean, we don't know for sure. I mean, he started off in Hamburg. His first job was, he was employed as the violinist, but he very quickly left the violin desks and came and conducted the orchestra. And that was the beginning of his, career from about 1703, 1704 as an operatic composer there. But it sort of paints a slightly not nice side of Handel, if we think about it in these terms. The Handel I know and love is a generous man. He's a man associated with charity, with good deeds, with looking after people. I mean, he founded the Society for Decayed Musicians. He was a generous philanthropic man. This speaks of a young teenage, pretty much almost teenage Handel. He's 22 at this point, actually having a joke at Corelli's expense, watching the old master struggle as the young kind of whippersnapper comes along and tries to show him who's boss. So it's slightly tinged, actually, but we don't see that with the other violin sonatas at all, do we? We don't see these stratospheric leaps.
No, they're sort of more ordinary. It's nothing personal in that sense. So I wouldn't know who they were written for. They could be written for anybody. They could just be written as nice pieces.
Yeah.
And sometimes in very tidy writing, sometimes in very messy writing. I've got a tidy writing here. This is the A major. That's his.
So that's actually Handel's autograph manuscript, which is, it's neat and tidy.
Yeah.
At the end of this chat, I'm going to put a link to a film I've prepared of the autograph manuscript of his final violin sonata. So he's around 65 at this time, and his handwriting is decidedly messy. It's ink splodges, crossings out. It's very hard to read, be that age or poor eyesight, or he was writing in a hurry. But I'll put a link up to that film, which accompanies Rachel's performance of the same sonata, taken from a CD, not live, of course, because we're still stuck between London and Hamburg, but hopefully within a few months, things might ease. But interesting to think about who might have played them. So the violinists in London, because we've got this first sonata in Rome, then we've got everything else that's associated with London, either in the 20s or the 30s, when the 4 works that don't have an autograph manuscript were published, or the early 50s, this final D major violin sonata. And just, we know that the violinist Geminiani was around and knew Handel. We know he was a fantastic violinist. There are a couple of other characters. A fantastic violinist called Matthew Dubourg, again associated with London and Ireland, who worked a lot for Handel. He could easily have played these pieces. Pietro Castrucci, an Italian. He worked with Handel in the earlier part. He would have only known that the sonatas from the 1720s, perhaps. Thomas Arne, he was a fantastic violinist. He lived, of course, longer than Handel, so he was a younger man at the time and would have performed these. And Rachel, you've come up with a really interesting connection to a violinist and a composer who's little known nowadays, but I think well worth exploring. Do you want to explain your theory?
Yes, well, it's Michael Festing, and I came across him actually because we've been playing a particular sonata by Joseph Gibbs, And we've been playing that particular sonata for about 20 years.
Yeah,
19, 20 years, a long time. And Joseph Gibbs was born in Dedham in Essex, and he lived there until 1748. And 2 years before he left for Ipswich, he published a set of violin sonatas, which are crazy, Italianate, fun, and also very English. So it's sort of a bit of a style mixture. And there is a portrait of Joseph Gibbs by Gainsborough. And in this portrait, it's in the National Portrait Gallery, we see Gibbs with music in the background, one volume Corelli, one volume Geminiani, and some music on the stand. And I was thinking, I wonder who that could be. I know that he was an admirer of Festing's music. And then I looked up, I went through Festing sonatas, and I found it was number one from Opus 7. And we delved into that a bit, and he must have been a fantastic violinist. So it's the same, he studied with Geminiani, so it's the same very crazy Italianate style, with lots of chordal works and flashy stuff, but also it's quirky. I think the stylistic what was wished for was quirkiness, was inventiveness, and a bit of madness in it, which Handel probably did not have enough of for some people. Maybe the people who liked Gibbs, who liked Festing, who liked Geminiani, they would prefer this quirkiness and this slightly craziness. Mm. So I think Festing is another good candidate.
I think it's fascinating to look at the time frame and the dates as well, because we've got this kind of flourishing of publications of violin sonatas by English or Italian composers in London in the 1740s, also for cello, because cello was a very popular instrument then, hence the Geminiani connection. I love to remind people that some of Geminiani's sonatas that they know for violin were initially published for cello and then transposed into different keys. But so we've got this flourishing at a time when Handel's very much occupied with other things. So if we look to where he's composing most of his chamber music, it fits into very specific periods. I don't think he was necessarily writing on spec, filling up, spare half an hour here or there. He was a very busy man. So we find some of the trio sonatas occurring in earlier parts of his life. They're always grouped together as a publication, but they were never, it's not like he sat down and wrote them over a 3-week period, like he wrote Messiah. That was written to a very tight deadline. So things are grouped together like the Opus 5 trio sonatas or the Opus 2 trio sonatas, but they span many years. And obviously the same for the violin sonatas. But I think certainly in the 30s and 40s, Handel's completely overtaken with either trying to resurrect his operatic career or moving full 100% into oratorio. And that's why we have a gap of no chamber music at all, actually, beyond the last publication is the late 30s for trio sonatas. So, and it could be that he was aware, he would have been aware, he had definitely had his finger on the pulse of what was going on around him. He was a very astute businessman. He knew what was being published. So he knew these works of Geminiani, Gibbs and Festing, presumably, and perhaps saw the direction of musical travel was slightly different to at that stage. He's an older man. He's perhaps not backwards looking, but his heart's in another genre of music by then, which is why I find the fact that we get the final D major sonata, it's like a kind of hello, I'm still here in 1751. We've had nothing from him in that vein for such a long time, and then suddenly we get that. Why?
Well, yeah, good question. By the time he's written that sonata in 1751, Festing has published many opuses of violin sonatas, at least 3 or 4. So he's had this sort of space in between the Handel's violin sonatas and the very final D major. He's basically he's flooded the market with his things. And the most striking reason why I thought that Festing could have been a candidate is that he was also part of founding the Society for Decayed Musicians. So they knew each other.
Yeah.
They were in opposite Italian opera houses, in rivaling houses, but they must have found a common denominator, at least with this society, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder, knowing what we know about the style of this music, Gimignani, Festing, other compositions around that time, it's crazy, it's wacky, it's quirky. I mean, Gimignani's cello sonatas were hated actually at the time, only by Charles Burney perhaps, who's known for being a bit of a, you know, grumpy old man when it comes to these things. But he wrote that the cello sonatas were full of whim and caprice and other expedients which didn't please anyone. He found them difficult to process orally, I think, because, as you've mentioned, the uneven phrase lengths, the strange quirky directions, you know, they're very mannered. There's lots of instructions for daggered, fairly abrupt bow strokes, lots of chords, and they're not particularly easy on the ear. You need to hear them more than once to understand the music, and that's not so with Handel. Handel is a very clear, kind of perfect line of communication, and just thinking about these pieces in this that Handel would have known in the 1740s. He comes along a few years later and adds his final violin sonata. Whether or not he knew it was his final one, we don't know. He was elderly, ill, not composing much by then, so perhaps he didn't have plans to add more violin sonatas to the canon, if you like. But it's very much a statement piece, I feel, this D major, and I do urge you to listen to it after this. It's not quirky in the way that Gimignani's music is, but it's as though he's honed his style over the years, and I love playing this piece. Also, it's interesting, it's got a very active bass line. Out of all of them, it's one of the most active. It's almost like a duet. It's often performed just with harpsichord, because the bass line is very keyboard, kind of ostinato writing. We love playing it because we can have quite a lot of fun with it, basically. The second movement, but the opening, I mean, I don't think you can achieve much more perfection than his opening to the effettuoso, the opening, which again, effettuoso is a very Gimignani term for a movement, a very Italian opening. It's not andante or largo or any of those kind of slow movement.
Yeah, and it is also, I think, I haven't looked through this on the other ones, but I think it's the one with the longest third movement, the longest proper slow movement. Sometimes they're just 5 bars or 8 bars, and this one really has approximately 40 bars. So he really goes into lengths here, and the final movement is in 3/4 time. So, and that's the only movement out of all the 9 sonatas we did, which is in a duple, as in it's not tripletty. It's not a compound time. All the other sonatas are in a compound time, so 3/8 or 6/8 or 9/8. So it's dum da dum da dum da dum, the nice jolly old thing. Whereas this last one in the D major is dotted, so it feels a bit like that, but it's not. He doesn't go off in his ti da 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 da. He goes so it's a very different feel to it, and that's the only one. Otherwise he's always triplet-y.
It's got a more solid, I feel that to be a more solid sonata actually. It's a very grounded piece. It strikes me as a very grown-up work actually, particularly when you take the slow movements into consideration. The opening, D, F sharp, A, instead of going up to D to complete the arpeggio, he goes to an E, which is the biggest pull you can have. I'm not going to sing it, but that opening is the suspension he creates and waits for the bass to move. It's like, I think it's a true master, top of his game at that point. I don't think it can be bettered.
No, and then he does a beautiful, a very simple but yet very effective fugue in the second movement, which he does sometimes in the other sonatas, or he just has something imitative. But this one is also, I like it, it's quite effective, and it gives the bass line a big role to play. A lot of top-bottom relationships here.
It's very involved, isn't it? It's a very equal dialogue, more so than the other pieces.
Does that mean that he knew who he was writing for?
I wonder with that one that he, especially bearing in mind that the fact that it's just isolated, it's a sonata that appears out of nowhere, if you like, after a 20-year absence. Did he have a violinist in mind? Did he have a cellist in mind as well, who might have played it? In our CD, I pose a couple of ideas for, you know, cellists who were around at the time, and I think the only candidate that I came up with, who again knew Handel, worked in a different capacity to him, but was a really known fab cellist of his day, could have been Jacobi Civetto, who wrote, again, really quirky sonatas himself. He had an incredible lifespan. He lived to be 101, and he lived to 1783, so he could easily have been playing at this time. In fact, he played right to the end of his life. He's the biggest known named London cellist around at that time. There are others from the earlier period who might well have played. Caporale was a cellist Handel worked with a lot. Francisco Caporale, he could have played the earlier sonatas. But yeah, I mean, we don't know. We're just playing kind of musical guesswork here. But it's really nice to imagine some of these characters. Perhaps Handel at the keyboard. He would have played the harpsichord. Perhaps Festing. No, Festing wouldn't have played the last sonata because he died by then, hadn't he?
No, he had one more year.
Oh, okay. But characters like that, Matthew Dubourg perhaps, or Arne playing it perhaps Civetto on the bass line. We don't know, but for me, it always helps bring these pieces to life. I mean, we bring them to life in our 21st century way, by sort of inhabiting the notes and giving our voice to them. And I love to think how we're merely continuing a tradition that started many hundreds of years ago. How might these performers have played, and what was their style? What might they have brought to the music? I suppose at the end of the day, it's just fantastic music. It's just great to have any opportunity to play it, and to ensure its continuation well into the next century, I hope, and beyond.
So, yeah, it's great fun. And yeah. Then the listeners can, viewers can listen to the D major after.
Yes, I'll put a link up to Rachel, Carolyn, and myself playing the D major violin sonata from our CD recording from 2018. Because we didn't film it visually, we just filmed it with microphones, not knowing that COVID was upon us. What I've done is added Handel's autograph manuscript to it, so you can follow the music in his own messy handwriting at the time, which I think will be a really lovely thing to do. Thank you very much for listening. It's just great fun to chat about these things and get a chance to air our thoughts and ramblings about music, which means so much to us.
Absolutely, it was great fun.
Yeah, and hope to see you soon. We'll be back with more chats, and see you soon, Rachel, I hope.
Bye.
Bye.